This is the first session then in the Bible Then and Now, where we're looking at the book of James. And this is our first of 5 sessions. It seemed good to let this book kind of correspond with Lent. Lent means a lot of different things to different people. One of the things that I appreciate about Lent is, I guess, the encouragement to do some self-reflection, to think about how we live and what we value and what we're chasing after and how that's good for us or perhaps bad for us. And James, it seems to me, is a really good book for that kind of work. James is a book that has a lot to say about the choices we make and the lives that we live. It's very much a book about actions or the deeds that we perform. It's a book that is sometimes unyielding in terms of the choices it puts before us. It's a book that really loves dualisms, right? There's this way or there's that way. It's not a book that's very fond of ambiguity, which makes it sometimes a frustrating book. I encounter a lot of ambiguity in my life. It's really that there's 2 simple choices of the good and the bad. But nevertheless, James, I think, still has a way, especially in a communal setting like this one, of asking us to slow down and to take a look and to think about how our lives affect not only our own well-being, but the lives of our neighbors as well. Also, James has 5 chapters and Lent has 5 weeks until Holy Week. So it seemed a really good match as well. We can do a chapter a week and it breaks up the book pretty nicely. I want to start by saying a few things about where James comes from. Some people find it helpful to know, like, what is this book and do we know anything about its origins and how did it end up in the pages of my Bible? And I'll say this, James, it's incredibly difficult with the book of James to figure out its origin story, to reconstruct the historical setting behind it. It's very difficult to tell who might have written it, when it was written, for whom it was written, because the book itself divulges really few specific details about where it came from. It doesn't tell us much about the target audience. It doesn't offer names of its readers. It doesn't refer to specific places or even really the author's past interaction with the readers. And so, unlike, for example, some of the letters that Paul wrote, where we know which churches he was writing to, where he might make reference to previous visits or previous communications, the book of James is just kind of floating there without a whole lot of anchoring to specifics in history. I'm going to share my screen here and put a couple of questions up here for our consideration. So hopefully you can see that. Oops, let me go back to this slide. A little photo of a spring there. James is a book that later on we'll see the image of a freshwater spring showing up in this book. But in terms of the origins of James, then I think we can ask maybe 4 questions around the bigger question of what kind of book is this. One is it a letter? Your Bible might call the book the Epistle of James or the Letter of James. It's in the part of the New Testament that contains a variety of letters of communications written from real people to real people in mostly the 1st century. So is it a letter? And if so, so what? Where did it come from? And if we can tell that, what difference does that make? Or so what? And then 3rd, to whom was the book written? And then, of course, so what? Why does that matter? And then 4th, why was it written? Can we tell anything about why the author might have thought it was important to write about these things? Really, the first 3 of those 4 questions: what kind of writing is it? What kind of genre? What kind of document is it? Who wrote it and where and to whom was it written? A lot of those questions really center on the opening verse of the book of James. And so here's the first verse. Here's James 1:1. It's not very exciting, but it at least provokes some of these questions. It says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. And that's about it. That's the prologue to the book, or the salutation to the book. If you've read other New Testament writings, especially some of Paul's letters, this format might look familiar to you. This is how ancient people wrote their letters, by naming themselves first and then naming the person or the persons that they were addressing the letter to. And there was usually some kind of a greeting or a benediction, or perhaps a prayer or a thanksgiving that was offered. This is all pretty economical. It's all pretty short. So James, we don't know which James. There are multiple Jameses in the ancient world, but James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's all we know about the author. The author never comes back to describe himself in any more detail. So it looks like a letter here at the outset. And traditionally, it's been called a letter or an epistle. But if we keep reading, or as we keep reading in James, we'll notice that it doesn't really read much like a letter. There's not a lot of personal, like I said, there's not really much personal information that's given. It reads a lot more like a sermon, or even like a moral treatise, kind of a list of encouragement that you might pass along to someone. It looks more like that, with kind of the format of a letter stuck on the very front. Does that matter? I put what, so what in those earlier questions. I don't think it really matters if it was actually formally a letter or not. We don't know how it circulated. We don't know if the author thought it was important that it came from him, or rather the author thought these are just good teachings that I want to spread around. In any case, it shows us some of the variety of early Christian literature, right? The New Testament has 4 Gospels. New Testament has the book of Acts, a story about the followers of Jesus in their early decades of the church. It's got a bunch of letters. It's got the book of Revelation. But some of these things that we call letters look more like sermons. They look more like treatises, and James is one of those. Next question, where did it come from? Who is James? The author identifies himself as James. Actually, in Greek, it's the word for Jacob. But traditionally in English, that's been rendered as James instead of Jacob. Jacob is originally a Hebrew name, which got carried over into Greek. And I think some English translators started to use the word James as a translation for what the Greek word is Jakobos, as a way of trying to avoid confusion. There are several Jameses named in the New Testament, one of whom was a brother of Jesus, or perhaps a half brother of Jesus. We don't really know for sure, but he's named in the Gospel of Mark as one of Jesus's brothers, and also named in the book of Acts as somebody who led the church in Jerusalem in its earliest years. Church tradition has kind of historically or traditionally assigned this book to James, the brother of Jesus. Do we know for sure that's who wrote it? No. Do we know for sure that James didn't write it? No, we simply don't know. But traditionally, the book has been associated with James, the brother of Jesus. Some people say that's why he doesn't spend a lot of time introducing himself. Everybody must have known who he was. That's a possibility. If James, the brother of Jesus, wrote the book, then it was probably written prior to the year 62, because we know from a Jewish historian that that's approximately the year that James, the brother of Jesus, was executed. We can place the death and resurrection of Jesus around the year 30, give or take 3 years. And so this is, roughly a generation, within the first generation or so of the church. There's no reference in the book of James to things like the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, which happened in the year 70. So it's a possibility that the brother of James wrote it at that time. Some people have said the Greek in here looks really too good for an agricultural worker or a fisherman from Galilee to have written it. Maybe it was written by somebody else, and maybe it was written later. That's possible. I'm not so sure it matters so much. I would note that nowhere does the author refer to his own authority. Nowhere does the author come in and say, I understand all this stuff really well because, I lived with Jesus, or I was close to Jesus, or I run the church in Jerusalem. There's just nothing about the letter that kind of depends on the authority of a particular James from the ancient world. So I just kind of leave the question open for myself. I really have no idea who wrote this book. Is it possible that James, the brother of Jesus, wrote it? I think absolutely. Is it possible that it was an early book, that it was written in the earliest decades of the church? I think probably. The Gospels were probably written between the years 70 and 100. Paul's letters are written roughly between the years 50 and 60. James could very well be the earliest book that we have in the New Testament, or the oldest book we have in the New Testament. It could very well have been written around the year 50 Does that make it better than any other book? Not necessarily, but it might give us some insight into how Christian teaching started to emerge. What kinds of things was the early church concerned about or worried about? So, for somebody like me who likes to study history, that makes the book even more interesting. The third question was, to whom was the book written? And here's what we get. It's written to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. That's it. That's all we know about that. What's interesting about this is there were no more 12 tribes of Israel in the first century. Roughly 600, 700 years prior to this, a lot of those tribes of the original 12 tribes of Israel were wiped out by the Assyrian army. And so there's some significant ambiguity about what the author means here. Some suggest, well, maybe this is a kind of an image or a metaphor for Jewish Christians, that he's referring to them as something like tribes. It's not necessary that it was written only to Jewish Christians, but that's a possibility. It's also noteworthy that he refers to the 12 tribes as being in the dispersion, or literally dispersed people, or people who live in a diaspora. They are people who are scattered and maybe have lost roots to their homeland. And I find that really interesting, that the author of this letter or this book addresses the church, or at least addresses some members of the church as dislocated people. Not clear if they're dislocated by choice or by violence or for whatever reason, but it's this imagination of the church of God or the people of God as being not fully at home in the world. Why I appreciate that is I think it's a really powerful image to think about dispersion. It's not language that I usually use to think of the church. You think about even the church building at Westminster. This does not look like a place where unrooted people are living, right? There's a sense of permanence about a strong building like that. But James writes to people who appear to be either on the move or who have had to migrate somewhere else. And of course, I didn't plan this when I started talking about James, but obviously in the last week or 10 days, we have, back to the questions, we have migrants on our mind, or we have refugees on our minds. Here's a recent photo of a woman with 2 children walking out of Ukraine. This is not necessarily a brand new crisis. There have been refugees streaming out of countries at kind of before now unknown or unseen rates, but now it's of course available on our TV screens 24 hours a day, with people coming out of Ukraine, right? Of refugees, essentially political refugees, people fleeing a war. So that image of dispersion or of dispersed people is a powerful one, and it turns me as well to a couple of paragraphs from a theological thinker named Willie James Jennings, who teaches at Yale Divinity School. And Jennings is he's a theologian who also studies what he calls, or what's referred to as, the African diaspora. So he's very interested in Black churches, primarily churches of not just of African immigrants, but theological traditions and churches in African American communities. And the idea of the African American community or African American communities being in a diaspora, themselves being in some ways unrooted from a home and living in some ways on loan in a new place. In the early pages of a book he wrote about the book of Acts, so a different biblical book, the Acts of the Apostles, Jennings has some reflections on diaspora that I think are really powerful that I want to share to you. I'll just read this out loud. But what he says, when we think about diaspora, we should recognize that diaspora means scattering and fragmentation, exile and loss. It means being displaced and in search of a place that could be made home, right? It's this idea of finding a new place. He goes on, danger and threat surround diaspora life. Diaspora, right, or life in the dispersion. That life is life crowded with self-questioning and questions for God concerning the anger, hatred, and violence visited upon a people. We must never confuse voluntary migration with diaspora, because diaspora is a geographic and social world not chosen, and a psychic state inescapable. The peoples who inhabit diaspora live with animus and violence filling the air they breathe. See what he's doing here, right? In many ways, he's talking about perhaps his own experience as an African-American, but also in many ways talking about other migrant communities or immigrant communities. But as well, he's talking about the first century and the ways in which some early Christians trying to find their place in the Roman Empire experienced a similar kind of dislocation. Jennings goes on, diaspora people live always on the verge of being classified enemy, always in evaluation of their productivity to the empire, always having an acceptance on loan, ready to be taken away at the first sign of sedition. Right? They have this kind of provisional acceptance. They live with fear as an ever-present partner in their lives, the fear of being turned into a them, a dangerous other, those people among us. They also remember loss of land and place, of life and hope, and even for some, loss of faith. Yet diaspora is also power. Right? There's this positive dimension to it, the power of a conviction to survive and the power of a confession to never yield to the forces that would destroy them. Diaspora is life by any means necessary. The condition of diaspora is often bound up with life under empire, right? Faith itself is always caught between diaspora and empire. It's always caught between those on the one side focused on survival and fixated on securing a future for their people, and on the other side with those intoxicated with the power and possibilities of empire and of building a world ordered by its financial, social, and political logics that claim to be the best possible way to bring stability and lasting peace. What Jennings is getting at here is that diaspora peoples often live with this choice between trying to preserve their own sense of identity, trying to preserve their own sense of who they are and their own hopes and their own cultural identity, and also being offered a choice toward assimilation, or choice being brought into a dominant group and perhaps adopting new values. So Jennings, writes about that, again, with his own experience in view. But Jennings is also, I think, opening up some really helpful doors to helping think about what the early church might have faced as a very, very, very small percentage-wise community within the Roman Empire, within a cultural system that promised prosperity, that promised security if people were to play by the rules. That some of those rules were religious, some of those rules were patriotic or were political. And we see this in the book of James. I mentioned earlier that we're going to see that James has a lot of these two choices, ways of framing things, right? There's this option or there's that option. There's a good option, there's a bad option. There's the way of following God or being a friend of God. And there's a dangerous way of following the world and the world's values or being a friend to the world. That's very much an oversimplification, I realize, but that's part of the power of the rhetoric, I think, of the book of James and even some other New Testament writings, is to think about that. Now, this is not obviously the only image for the church that we find in the New Testament. It's probably not the best image for the church. If I'm honest, I do not live as a diaspora person in my own life. I'm very well rooted in the system. I'm rewarded by the social system that I live in. So I don't want to claim a kind of diaspora or a dispersed or a dislocated identity for myself. But a lot of people obviously do live with that in our midst, maybe even in this Zoom call. But it's also a way of thinking about the church and kind of how the church tries to be an alternate society rooted within a larger society and all of its systems. Let me just pause there. We've only gotten through one verse of James, I realized, and it's already 7:26. I promise the pace will pick up in time, but I wanted to at least kind of set the table for how this book imagines who it's writing to and how it characterizes its readers. And maybe there's a question, or maybe somebody has an insight, either from the Jennings quote or something else that I said, or maybe even a question. So if anyone wants to break in, this would be a good moment. Otherwise, I can keep going.
Matt, given that the Roman occupation of the time, would the Jews in Jerusalem have really felt like not only the Christians, but the Jews in the community have felt like they were a diaspora people in their own land?
In their own land is an interesting question. Probably not so much in their own land, like around Jerusalem and other places. they probably certainly felt like an occupied people, which is a different thing. Not that there was a Roman soldier on every corner, but as Roman money streamed in, as Roman power streamed in, as opportunities for trade streamed in, it seems that there were a lot of, like, there was a price to be paid, right? To participate in this, you would have to adopt certain Roman customs, and that always comes with the risk of idolatry and other kinds of religious problems. For the most part, though, in the first century, there are more Jews living outside of Judea than there are living inside of Judea. I mean, this is a reality that Judaism was very dispersed, and also was multi-ethnic. So, I mean, there were Jews living in sub-Saharan Africa, different parts of the Roman Empire as well. So, kind of Jewish identity was already had this sense of being kind of spread out. In some places that came with persecution, but not every place. So it's kind of a mixed bag, I guess, is part of it. If James is writing to Jewish Christians, or maybe a more accurate way, Jews who are following Jesus as the Messiah in the first century, some of them might have been chased out of Jerusalem already, if what the book of Acts says about that is accurate, that there was a persecution that sprang up that basically kind of pushed Christians outwards. They probably had to flee into Syria or what's now Lebanon and things like that. Not that that gets at it. But it kind of depends. In some places it was a dangerous thing to be Jewish in the Roman Empire. Depends on what city you were in. Dean in the chat asked about the Greek being pretty advanced. Yeah, the Greek in James does have a kind of flair to it. It's not elegant or like really super sophisticated Greek, but it is. It's not bad either. How about that? And so, yeah, some people have wondered if, again, if some guy from Nazareth could have written it. Some of the pushback against that is it's just a realization that people were speaking Greek everywhere, and people had access to even Greek literature in a lot of places in the ancient world. It's a possibility, but if we had other things written by James we could compare it to, that would help. But this is the only piece of writing that exists that claims to be written by this James. So this is kind of all we've got.
Matt, this is Caroline. What was the faith is always caught between? What was the opening line of?
Let me go back and check.
Thank you.
This one?
Nope. Next one. Nope. That one. Between
faith being caught between diaspora and empire.
Yeah. Those on the one side focused on survival. Thank you. I want that. Thank you.
You said you want that? I'm sorry.
Yes, I want that.
Yeah, well, and I mean, not to spoil or not to turn this into a conversation about Jennings's book, but he goes on to say there's nothing necessarily virtuous about diaspora and evil about empire, that they both have their risks. As he goes on, he imagines Christianity as providing a kind of third way between those options that allows you to hold on to your distinctive identity while not having to capitulate to certain dominant values.
Well, if one is caught in between those, that is the third way, right?
Yeah, could be. Yep. I see Mark and CW have their hands up, and then I'll move on, I think.
Well, Matt, I think you've really put your finger on what I struggle with and find so hard, is Christianity, as we read it in the New Testament, is the story of a persecuted people, of a minority. And yet here many of us are, particularly at Westminster. It is a wealthy church. Many of the people who are members there are amongst the pillars of society, who have large 401k accounts, who are isolated from the challenges and the daily tribulations of so many people. And I oftentimes think it's really hard to be a Christian and fight that kind of constant battle between having a lot and having too much and knowing how to fit in. And I think that's a part of what James addresses. So I think it's a very real message that has survived for nearly two millennia.
Yeah, well, as we get into chapter 1, we'll see that James is going to start off by talking about how we should consider it joyful when we encounter trials and difficulties. So it's going to be, in many ways, it's a foreign message to at least kind of how I try to organize my life, right? I organize my life to limit unhappiness. CW.
Hey, Matt, yeah, I was curious about the conversation about dating, because my understanding is that the minority view was the early dating, but that the two positions have kind of coalesced around the debate about authorship also. Like, I was curious what your personal view was about the merits of the pseudonymous position, and where you fall in that whole thing, and maybe what is the majority view now, as you understand it.
Yeah, I have to summarize and be quick. I mean, in terms of who wrote the book, there are plenty of scholars who think that it was written by James, brother of Jesus, and plenty who don't. And those positions don't always line up really neatly, like on a liberal conservative axis, to use those words. They just don't. In a lot of the late 20th century, people thought that James was probably written in the 2nd century. A lot of that has to do with certain assumptions that some 19th and early 20th century German theologians made about James that I think are wrong. It's always easy to pick on the 19th century Germans, but which I like to do. I'm not sure there really is a consensus right now, but there is really a range, anywhere from 50 to 110. And different points in between are what people suggest. So I kind of think that James is a bit earlier. I think that the way it talks about Jesus, or at least alludes to teachings from Jesus, might suggest ways in which James reflects how stories about Jesus and his moral teachings were being told and retold in different Christian settings. But I'm going to put a caveat. I could be totally wrong.
Yeah. Do you have a horse in the authorship rate, and does that affect your own opinion about dating?
I don't really have a horse in the race. I just am kind of skeptical about our ability to date anything really well, and choose an author really well. And so I'm kind of, when it comes to historical questions, if I don't have a lot of evidence, I try to remain kind of undecided, or not. I don't bet on those horses.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen because I'm still in verse 1, I realize, but yeah, that's for session. That's what happens in session 1. Why was the book of James written? Great question. I wish we knew, but this gets to the issue of what's the book finally about. And Mark alluded to this in his comment that James reflects people undergoing persecution, perhaps, or certainly undergoing difficulty and a variety of pressures in the world. This is a book that is really big on moral instruction. This is a book that has 108 verses, and in those 108 verses, there are 59 different imperatives or commands, right? This is a book that loves to tell you what to do or how to live. It resembles, for example, in places, it resembles the book of Proverbs, if you're familiar with that, in the Old Testament, with a lot of advice about how to live, a lot of ways of structuring, teaching about how to structure your life, not necessarily in a way that's pleasing to God, but in a way that brings out life, in a way that becomes a kind of, almost a kind of living act of worship to God. So when we talk about wisdom in James or in other writings, it's not wisdom in the sense of great ideas or really clever thoughts. It's wisdom in the sense of kind of imprinting on one's lives and one's daily habits and one's values and the decisions that one makes, ways of living that hopefully help people encounter the goodness of God in how they live. There are ways in which James reflects some of the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels. There are parts of this book that look a lot like some of the material that we find when Jesus offers sermons or other sayings. It's a book that's really interested in how Christians or how Christ followers conduct ourselves, how we live out our lives. That makes it a really different kind of book in the New Testament. It doesn't have much in terms of, very little, in fact, about storytelling. It barely ever mentions Jesus by name as well, which is interesting. It has only one mention to the Holy Spirit, and that's even a kind of vague reference. It doesn't spend a lot of time rooting its moral instruction in like in Jesus himself. Like, it doesn't say Jesus acted like this, therefore you should. There are ways in which then the book of James has been like diminished or has been criticized throughout history as being not theological enough, or not being focused on God enough, or rather that some have charged that James is just too worried about offering instruction about how to live and doesn't provide enough room for describing how God is active in our lives. I would push back against that and say that James actually roots its theology in the ways in which we live, that James is a lot less interested in belief as kind of a cognitive or an intellectual thing. And for James, belief is much more about the actions of our lives, the patterns of our lives, the behaviors of our lives. In other words, it's a way of thinking theologically that's not necessarily about thinking, but is more about doing and about action. Hopefully you get that. Hopefully what I'm saying there makes some sense, or the distinction I'm making makes sense. For James, authentic belief is going to be belief that shows itself in how individuals and how a community of faith conduct themselves. It's a book that's deeply concerned about communal well-being, and that well-being is less about believing all of the right stuff and more about acting in ways that reflect the goodness of God in the world as we see in Christ. So with all of that said, we're finally ready to jump into chapter 1 beyond the first verse. I would ask you that as we walk through the 27 verses in the first chapter of James, notice at least, there's more than these, but look for at least 3 things. One is the focus on endurance. This is a book that urges people to remain faithful, or to remain committed to the work of God in their lives. Focus on wisdom as well, which we'll come back to, but also obedience. Obedience is not always the favorite word to use in churches. A lot of churches push back against using the term obedience because it gets misused in so many religious contexts, right? Where obedience gets equated with not asking questions or knowing your place in a hierarchy. I'm not so sure that's what James is talking about when it refers to obedience. I think for James, obedience is much more about what it means to live a life of gratitude, or to live a life in response to the good gifts of God. The shadow side of all of these, or the contrast, right, are ways in which endurance is contrasted to immaturity, or just kind of transience, a kind of unrootedness, or an unclear identity, kind of a lack of clarity about who we are. The opposite of wisdom for James is perhaps foolishness, or maybe even worldliness, a kind of way of chasing after the world's folly or the world's values. And the opposite, or the contrast to obedience, would be divided loyalties or double-mindedness. One of the things that the book of James despises the most are people who act in ways that don't reflect who they really are, or people who act out of a kind of not just hypocrisy, but who act out of a kind of mixed loyalty. Rather, for James, a thing is what it is. If you plant an orange tree in the ground, you should get oranges. If you go to a spring that's supposed to have fresh water, foul water is not supposed to come out of it. There's a kind of simplicity to the way in which James views things, that things are supposed to be, if your loyalty is to God, that should come out in the ways in which you act. Or as James puts it in the 21st verse, welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. That notion of the word being implanted in you, right, or dwelling within you, is an important image for James. So James isn't a book that just says work harder, try harder, I wish you were a better person. James very much is talking about ways in which we cultivate the goodness of God in our lives. So chapter 1, I've been promising this for some time now. I already read verse 1, so we're going to skip that. And then James jumps right in. This first chapter appears to be not very well organized. In other words, James jumps from topic to topic in a hurry, but a lot of the topics that show up in chapter 1 will reoccur. They'll come back in chapters 2 through 5. So in some ways, James is just dumping some things on the table here in front of us. And as the book continues, James will do a little bit more to examine each of those things that it's dumped out of the box. So my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and that endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. Hold on to those words, trials and testing. They're in Greek, those are they're cognates. They're essentially the same word, and we'll see it showing up again later on in chapter 1. So whenever you face trials, or testing is another possible interpretation or another possible translation of that. It also will get translated as temptation, but I think in this case, trial is a pretty good translation, or test. What are those things? They aren't necessarily like being tripped up, but they or kind of being tricked, but they are ways in which life throws difficulties our way. They are hardships of various kinds. They don't necessarily all have to be about persecution or threat of violence, but they're about difficulty, which of course we all face in a variety of ways. But James is trying to insist here, right out of the gate, that the opportunity to face these trials or to endure these trials should be in some way a source of joy, not necessarily happiness, right, but joy, because James sees these trials, these things that test our faith, that grow our faith, have the opportunity to produce endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. None of us want trials or tests in our lives, but we probably all can recognize ways in which having gone through things has helped to develop us, not just develop character, but to develop resilience and maybe even maturity in some of us. If any of you is lacking in wisdom, there's that other theme, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given you. Maybe you hear echoes here. Jesus has a teaching about prayer, about asking God for things. You know, if you ask a loving parent for bread, they're not going to give you a stone in return. There might be some echoes here of some things that Jesus teaches in the Gospels. But ask in faith, never doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For the doubter, being double-minded, there's that term, and unstable in every way, must not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Well, that's a little harsh coming from me, somebody who doubts often, but also who sees doubt as not the enemy of faith, but sometimes a catalyst for faith. But James here, like I said, tends to have an all or nothing view on some things, seeing faith and doubt as these two different things. The problem with doubt for James appears to be not so much that you don't have maybe the intellectual strength to believe harder, but the problem with doubt is this idea of becoming double-minded, or maybe serving two different sets of values, or not having your mind focused solely on God, but becoming distracted or unstable in certain ways. Doubt might be choosing other things to put one's faith in, as opposed to God. Let's keep going. We'll come back and discuss some of this in a moment. Let the believer who is lowly boast in being raised up, and the rich in being brought low, because the rich will disappear like a flower in the field. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the field, its flower falls and its beauty perishes. It's the same way with the rich. In the midst of a busy life, they will wither away. Well, that's discouraging for me. But what's going on here? What does this sound like? You might hear, again, echoes of the Gospels in some ways. You might hear echoes of what Mary prays or sings in the opening chapter of Luke's Gospel about the poor being raised up and the powerful of the rich going away empty. It's a familiar theme in some of the Gospels. There's concerns about the rich. James will have some of the most harsh and unyielding things to say about wealth. We're just getting warmed up. This is a tough book to read for those of us, right, who consider ourselves among the world's population, especially being very privileged. I don't think this is necessarily about judgment or punishment, right? That line about the sun and its scorching heat might get your attention, but it's more this sense of maybe the impermanence of things, right? In the midst of a busy life, the rich will wither away. It's almost how much better to be raised up by God than to live a life of distraction and perhaps frittering away one's time. James will get a lot clearer in later chapters about the ways in which God seems to prefer the poor, in which God seems to have a special heart for the poor and the powerless. And so we'll want to read that and continue to follow that theme. James keeps going. Blessed is anyone who endures temptation. And there's a similar word again to that word testing that we saw earlier, which can also mean temptation, but we tend to think of temptation in the sense of, here's a second helping of ice cream. You're going to take it or are you not, right? Or here's power. Are you going to take it or are you not? Here's a chance to cheat on your taxes. Are you going to take it or are you not? I think the word for testing is a lot broader than that. Can you tell I helped my adult children with their taxes today? That I had 2 of them emailing me with questions like, I know how to do taxes. Blessed is anyone who endures temptation or knows how to endure testing, right? Such a one has stood the test and will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. No one, when tempted, should say, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil. And God himself, or God tempts no one. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. And then when that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And that sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Do not be deceived. And I can't read that last line because my captions are covering it. But anyway, there it is. Notice some of the imagery here about temptation, right? It's not that God is tempting you, but temptation seems to be something that we have to deal with in our own struggle to remain single-minded. But as well, James has this interesting line about being tempted by desire, and then desire becomes conceived, and then desire gives birth to sin, and sin gives birth to death. This idea of bringing calamity into the world and using birthing imagery to describe that. What's interesting about that to me is where it goes next. Every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In fulfillment of God's own purpose, God gave us birth, there's birthing imagery again, by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of God's creatures. So here's a rare in the New Testament, but imagery about God giving birth, or at least being engaged in a birthing process, which is important to hold up. We do have that kind of imagery about God in the Bible itself, and even here in the Newer Testament. But as well, right, there's a way in which desire and sin give birth to calamity, but as well, God gives birth by the word of truth in order that we might become a kind, of first fruits of God's creatures. There's a kind of constancy here, the way in which James describes who God is. You must understand this, my beloved, let everyone be quick to listen, so to speak. Again, the topic changes again, but later on in James, there'll be a more sustained passage or a more sustained set of paragraphs about speech and the importance of honest speech and speech with integrity. Slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Therefore, rid yourselves of all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. Again, that notion of implanted here, I think, is important. It's language that gets used in some Greek philosophical movements as well, to talk about truth being something that's implanted in people. The vocabulary here has to do with conception as well, like conceiving a child, becoming impregnated, right? That notion of having something inside you, right? A word from God that grows, and ultimately the person bears. So that imagery is powerful and part of what James is talking about. Why is James so unyielding at times? Because James honestly believes that this implanted word of God, the ways in which we have, that we're conceiving God's word in the world, has power for salvation. I got to keep running along here. So I'm done by 8, but be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. Another big theme, a lot of chapter 2 next week will come back to this, right? This is what James wants. Don't just listen, don't just spout off things. Don't worry about working yourself into the right kind of belief. That's not the end of Christian faith. Rather, this idea of how the word of God manifests itself in our actions is important. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves and on going away, immediately forget what they were like, right? You glance in the mirror at yourself, take it all in or whatever, and then you've forgotten what you look like. Again, there's language here that's familiar in some Greek philosophical writings. So there's a lot going on in James. There seems to be echoes of Jesus' teachings. There's echoes of other Jewish teachings around the right ways to live. There's also ways in which James seems to be aware of certain kind of Greek philosophical teachings, this idea of examining oneself in a mirror, that kind of self-discipline, that kind of introspection being important. So it's not looking at yourself in the mirror here as a kind of vanity or kind of narcissism, right? But looking at oneself in the mirror as introspective, of taking the time to know who you really are. But those who look into the perfect law, right, in contrast to looking in the mirror, those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, I think here he's talking about God's Torah, God's teachings we encounter in the Old Testament, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. If any, we're almost done here with the chapter, if any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. The language here for religion is interesting. There's different Greek words for religion. And what James uses here is the word that tends to describe like the worship acts of religion, or what some sociologists or anthropologists would call the cultic acts of religion. Things like sacrifices, things like burning incense, things like other kinds of religious practices. Or in our own lives, we might talk about things like prayer or fasting, or maybe even sacraments, right? The kinds of actions that you do to identify yourself as a religious adherent or as a follower of a certain God, the kinds of things you do in public to unlock blessing for yourself or to encounter God in your daily life. That's what James means here when the book is talking about being religious. So you're religious, your practices are worthless if you're deceiving your heart. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God, right? Religious practices that are pure and undefiled before God are these, or is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. It's this lovely reminder that all devotion has a social element to it, right? Devotion isn't just what you do in Sunday mornings, what you do while you're in church on Sunday, that even our religious activities, the things that we do when we gather around a table together, all of these things have social elements in them. If they don't involve caring for those in distress, that religious practice becomes worthless. James will keep coming back to this, right? How does our religious practice transform us? How does it reflect our own transformation? How does it change the ways in which we view others or interact with others? The last thing I want to note is this final verse in chapter 1 here is the first place where the expression the world appears in the letter. James won't say a ton of things about the world, but occasionally the world is this foil to who God is, right? Or the values of the world are different from the values of God. So again, notice what James is doing, right? James is helping its readers navigate their way through a landscape that James thinks is dangerous, not necessarily because it's fraught with persecution, although it might have been that for James's readers, but because the world is this source of distraction, right? The values of this world are the source of distraction. That can be overstated. I'm not saying that James necessarily demands a Christianity that is like sectarian or that involves removing oneself. But James is really, really worried about a church falling prey to the temptation of adopting false values. How James works that out, we'll have to see in upcoming weeks. But really in this opening chapter, we just get a lot in a hurry from James, moving from topic to topic. And I want to make sure we had a little bit of time to address any questions or anything like that. I recognize it's also just about 8 o'clock, and I can't speak much faster than I've been speaking. But are there any, have I lost anybody, or is there like a particular question about something there in James, or maybe a comment that's burning a hole in your screen that you want to share with the group? Otherwise, I've got more. I see Ken has unmuted himself.
Yes, I kept rereading this over the weekend, well, over the last couple of days, and the verses 5 to 8 about doubting were difficult for me. As I think you mentioned, perhaps they are difficult for you as well. It seems like James doesn't quite understand that people are not perfect, that people do doubt, or that do make mistakes, or do question and try to resolve things. And it isn't running away from a belief in God, but to something else, but rather a struggle to put pieces together that are perfect in God's sense, but imperfect in the human sense. So I struggled a bit with his comments on doubt, and was hopeful you'd say a few more words about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say again, I'm with you, Ken. And I don't think doubt is an enemy of faith. I think, like I said, I think doubt can be a catalyst. Maybe catalyst is the wrong word. You're the chemist. You would help me with knowing about catalysts, but it's a means by which faith is sometimes tested and sometimes reborn and renewed, sometimes to a better, more secure, maybe a more intelligent faith, or a more sympathetic faith or compassionate faith. At least that's my experience. I know the experience of a lot of others. I think that what doubt means here is not so much unbelief as it is a kind of a wandering loyalty, which of course is also, we're all prone to that as well. I hear faith and doubt in my own head, and I typically think cognition or intellect. That's partly just how I'm wired and what I do for a living and all of that. But obviously faith is a lot more than just, are you believing the right stuff? Or are you able to face every challenge by giving yourself this pep talk that I can believe. I don't find that necessarily helpful. So, I mean, on the one hand, I would say it seems to be more of a lack of loyalty. On the other hand, I would say, what if we consider this book written not so much to a group of discrete individuals, but written to a community? There are the times when I most need to be in church are the times when I'm doubting the most personally, right? because I need to be surrounded by people who can believe for me, or can be kind of a proxy for me in believing. At least I can name times in my life that's been really powerful and important, which doesn't mean if you see me in church that I'm always necessarily doubting, but you know what I mean? There's this kind of sense in which belief and doubt can be things that a community holds in trust together. And we can carry that for one another. I know the story of a professor at the seminary where I teach. This is before my time, who had a child who died tragically, and talked about coming to chapel and needing people to recite the creed, the Apostles' Creed, simply because he couldn't. He had gotten to a point where he couldn't say the words anymore because he was just devastated and entertaining the idea that maybe God is cruel and maybe God is not worthy of devotion and worship, but needed to hear other people say that precisely because he couldn't, which I've always found a really helpful way of thinking about some of these things, that's how it works for a lot of us sometimes, which is why, again, community is so important, because if a community is not faithful or not a trustworthy place for individuals, they're not going to stick around during their doubts or during their struggles, right? They're going to go find a different community. They're going to leave it. And so those are my best thoughts on the matter. There's probably other people in the room who can do that much better. So in the chat, right? Hesitating and hesitate instead of doubt. And then, yeah, doubt is a valuable component for faith. Otherwise, we have certainty, which is the opposite of faith. That's true. It's really not fun to be around people in Christian settings who are 100% certain about everything. Manly Olson, your hand's up, and I'm going to break us into groups.
Would you comment on what Luther and Calvin thought about the book of James?
Sure. Well, Luther's kind of famous for slighting the book of James, referred to it as an epistle of straw. But it's not the case. I don't read a ton of Luther, but I spent a ton of time with Lutherans. So it's not the case that Luther hated the book or thought it was terrible. But Luther thought that James didn't preach the gospel as well as other books did. And it didn't name Jesus enough. It didn't offer enough promises about what God does for us. I think James saw it as a book that just said, work harder, work harder, work harder. And that was off-putting to Luther. Where Luther does discuss the book in more detail, he's worried that people are going to misunderstand it, that they're going to take it as a kind of requirement for what it means to be a believer, and miss the graciousness of God. So Luther's famous for the first New Testament he published in German has 23 New Testament writings, and there's a blank line in the table of contents, and then comes James, or Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation. He kind of set apart those 4 books because he wasn't quite as fond of them as the others. In terms of Calvin, I don't know. I'd have to go back to school. Do you know what Calvin thought about James? I don't know what Calvin particularly thought about it, so I'd have to look that up. I should point out too, James is a really peculiar book as New Testament writings go, because it is, like I said, largely commandment driven or largely imperative driven. So I would never say that James should probably be the only book you read, but how do we put it in conversation with other parts of the New Testament are really important. I would even offer that that's why Ken and I are disturbed by the parts about doubt, because maybe there are other parts of the New Testament that offer a little bit more reassurance to doubters. So we have other parts of the Bible that tell us that doubt isn't necessarily a fatal flaw. And so when we encounter those words in James, that's maybe why we bristle a little bit. But that's chapter 1. Next week, we'll look at chapter 2. And for those watching the recording, here are the questions. So you can pause the video and look at these. And hopefully we'll see you in a future week in person.